And just thanks to Eve for hosting today. So it's Eve's Zoom that we're all on. And I know we've come to this from different places. So Eve's bit kindly provided the facility for us to all talk to each other. And the reason I think we're talking about the local plan is because Merton Council's local plan is at the sort of last stage of its public consultation, which ends on the 1st of February. So we've got an opportunity over the next 5 or 6 weeks to shape and to inform the local plan. So I'm going to walk us through what a local plan is, but also where it fits into the wider role that planning makes in informing and shaping and deciding on development and change in our areas. So that's me. So to understand what local plans are, we need to understand what planning is, because it's one part of a bigger system for managing development in the public interest. So almost always run by a local authority, national parks in some places, who are making planning decisions of various kinds on behalf of the rest of us through the the fact that they represent us through the election of councillors and councils via the electoral process. So in the public interest being really important, clearly managing a lot of private interests to achieve that. But managing development, and development has a very particular meaning when it comes to planning. And this is an extract, there won't be many of them, from the legislation of what is development. It isn't just what it is in the sort of Oxford English Dictionary. It's got a very particular and precise legal definition. So it's building stuff, engineering, that's sort of constructing bridges, mining, digging things out, or other operations. That could be, for example, landfill, in, on, over, or under land, or making any material change in the use. So you can do development without actually building anything, because you might want to change the use of something from, I don't know, a sports field to a market. So, or change a building from being used as a shop to being used as a house or a home. And there's no physical change involved in that, but it is development. And it affects both buildings and it affects land. And these definitions become important because they really shape and inform what can be influenced and what can't be influenced by planning decisions and by local plans. So the management of this development takes place in a number of ways through the planning system. Forward planning is what we're talking about this evening, so that's the local plan. In a London context, you also have a London plan, and there are also neighbourhood plans, which there aren't any in Merton yet, but there are about 50 odd across London, which are much more neighbourhood based plans, actually developed and run by the local community. Then there's development management. So that's planning applications, basically. So that's the individual decisions you make on the actual proposal to develop a piece of land. Then planning applications often come with strings attached. So there are either legal commitments that need to be met, such as providing affordable housing, that's obligations, or planning conditions that you must do something to make your planning consent legitimate. So you might have a condition to look after a tree and also not to remove that when you're doing your development. And then last but not least, there needs to be a system which means if everyone ignores everything else, they can't get away with it. And that's where enforcement comes in. It's actually a discretionary power, so local authorities aren't legally required to enforce if there is a breach of planning, if someone does development without getting permission. But clearly, it's an issue on which you can put a certain amount of pressure onto local authorities. But it's also something of a Cinderella of planning, which tends to get very few resources and gets caught up in lots of sort of legal treacle, which makes it quite difficult to get action taken on the ground. So just to try and explain how that boils down into what you can and can't control through planning. So there's a whole lot of things which you might think are development which don't fit into the legal definition of development. So if I'm a farmer and I choose to grow barley this year instead of wheat, That obviously makes a big change to the landscape. It's much bigger than, you know, a small development, sticking a satellite dish in my house or something, but it doesn't come under the planning system. So there are certain operations like farming and forestry which are completely out with the planning system, so entirely unable to be informed or influenced by planning decisions. It does make it quite interesting. So if I've got a couple of trees and I chop them down, if I'm doing it for forest, there's no planning controls. If I'm doing it because it's part of a development of a new house, then it does fall under planning. So the same act can actually fall under planning or not fall under planning, depending on what it's being done for. So everything else that isn't excluded falls into the definition of development, but then the government, in its wisdom, then excludes a lot of development from the need to put in a planning application. This is why lots of small-scale developments don't require a planning application. The most obvious being, you know, domestic extensions of a certain scale or loft conversions. So you can do these without any. They still need to fit in with building regulations, but you don't need to put in a planning application. And there's a whole raft of permitted developments, and they're increasingly complicated, and they also apply to changes of use as well as to buildings. Then you get things of development, which are not permitted development, for which you need a planning application. So looking at the concentric circles there, you've got planning application. So a new house would be an obvious example of that. Then you might get a planning application, you might get permission for something with a condition attached to retain a tree or an obligation to provide affordable housing. And then right in the heart of the circle, there's also, which won't distract us too much tonight, there's a fee which is generated by development in most locations these days called the Community Infrastructure Levy, which is a new source of funding, which can then go on to all sorts of things which are decided locally. So an example is that you could get some money to look after a bit of green space, which is you know, in the neighbourhood that's got the development going on, because looking after the green space is a sort of logical consequence of there being more people living there, therefore it needing more funding to look after. So I'm sure you're all watching that really closely. We're not literally going to take the test, but just to go through some examples. So can a local plan deal with any or all of these issues? I can't see everyone, so let's not do the hand display, but just taking them from the top. So can a local plan deal with the design of new homes? Yes, it can, because it's a development. It's a building, and what the building looks like is subject to planning control. Can it inform the number of new homes? You know, are there 30 on this piece of land, or are there 500 in this part of a borough? Yes, it can, because they all require planning permission for planning application. Can it say this piece of green space is valuable and shouldn't be built on and should be looked after for other reasons, like nature, or the rain can filter into the soil, or people like walking on it? Yes, it can, because that's protecting it from development. It can't protect it from someone going in there with a tractor and making it go all muddy. It can't protect it from mismanagement. It can't protect it from the hedges being flailed instead of trimmed, but it can protect it from development. Can a local plan deal with domestic extensions? Well, that's in the it depends category, and I'm afraid there's quite a lot of planning which is in the it depends category. So it depends on the size of the extension. A small extension is permitted development, and you can't really do anything about it because no one needs to know that you're doing it for the purpose of planning. A large extension would fall under planning controls and require an application. Do you need, as Merton has done, to introduce 20-mile-an-hour speed limits in an area? Do you need planning consent? The answer to that is no, you don't, because a lot of highways issues are dealt with under highways legislation. So road humps and traffic lights and 20-mile-an-hour speed limits and junction boxes and all those things, they're all controlled under, and parking, controlled parking zones, those sorts of things, are all controlled under highways legislation. There's quite an important interaction with planning, but it's not one that planning can do anything about. Can it do something about changing an office to a house? Well, historically it could have done, because that would have been a change of use. Now it can't do anything about that because that's now permitted development. So there's quite wide permitted developments now, and you'll see that across the borough, where buildings are being turned into houses or to flats, which used to be offices. If they change the outside of that building, then they need to get a planning application in. But if they're simply doing it by changing the inside, then that doesn't require a planning application. Can planning protect trees? That's in the it depends category. As I mentioned earlier, if it's to do with a development taking place, then yes, it can. If it's to do with forestry, then that's outside planning controls. Can it ensure your parks being well managed, that the ponds being sort of looked after, that the playground's kept in good order, that the trees are pruned? No, it can't, because none of that requires a planning application. You might be able to get some money off the back of some planning, but it can't manage management issues. That would include managing streets and public spaces as well, and not directly planning issues. There are some conditions you can attach sometimes to make sure that things are being looked after in the future off the back of development. Can you list a building through planning? No, you can't nationally list a building, because that's something that's done under separate heritage legislation and needs in fact, the Secretary of State's approval, with Historic England making a recommendation. What you can do is identify locally important buildings, which effectively are like having a local list and have the same levels of protection as they would if they had a local list. You can have a local list without a plan, but you can also identify in a plan heritage buildings or heritage spaces. Can you, through planning, control the noise and pollution from a factory? No, you can't if it's already there. I don't know, a waste site, a waste management site might be a good example at the moment. Quite noisy, lots of lorries going in, lots of smells coming out of it. But often these will have had planning conditions attached to them. Depends on when they got permission. So if there are planning conditions attached to them, then those are sort of enforcement issues. Or if new factories are being built, then you can, in a local plan, inform the conditions that would be attached to a new planning permission. And can you limit the number of hot food takeaways on the high street? So this is a growing issue, often driven by public health concerns. The number of sort of kebab shops and takeaways, and too many of them, there's evidence, are having impacts on public health. The answer to that is yes, you can. And there's a growing number of policies which are beginning to do that, or which are saying that you can't have hot food takeaways within X hundred meters of a school, as an example, because hot food takeaways almost always require planning consent to either build a new one or to change the use of an existing building, even if it's already in retail use. To hot food takeaway would require a planning application to go in. So the shorthand, if you're thinking, is it worth looking at the local plan to have an impact, is if it needs a planning application, then it can be influenced by a local plan. If it doesn't, then it can't directly. So coming on to what a local plan is, so within all the other things that you do with the planning system. So this is, again, this is a quote from government's guidance. Fundamentally, a local plan is about looking ahead and making sure that we're thinking about what the needs are going to be of the future, and not just doing that on a hunch, but doing that on the basis of research and evidence as to what is going to be required. And what's going to be required isn't just about how many homes are required, which is what often captures the headlines. It's also issues about the amount of sort of industrial or employment force base, how many community facilities are required, what the infrastructure is that's going to support that, so things like schools and hospitals, but also what the needs are for nature, and what the needs are for dealing with climate, what the needs are for looking after the historic environment, what the needs are for ensuring that water is going to be appropriately managed, and doing it in a way which is well designed. So there's no fixed limit for plans. They tend to be looking 15, 20, 25 years out. And that's the kind of time frame that people are planning for. The reality is that you would revise your plan. You wouldn't sort of produce it and then hope it was still valid 25 years later, because inevitably they get out of date. But it's very much looking to the future, anticipating the change, but informed by research and evidence which justifies the approach to development that's being taken. And the evidence is a really important part of the plan. It's not just what's written on the page, it's the evidence that lies behind it. So the foundations are, you have a lot of research, and this is beginning to be obvious what Merton Council have been doing on this. So on the housing side, generally a lot of those decisions have already been made at a London level as to what Merton's housing requirement is, and lots of complicated sort of formulae and other things which can be debated, but often there's not much room for manoeuvre when it gets down to the local plan. Those decisions have already been made. But the amount of employment space, the amount of open space, Merton's doing a sort of open space strategy at the moment, understanding its sort of wildlife inheritance. There's a lot of work being done around climate at the moment, understanding the historic assets that exist, and both nationally and locally. Those are just some of the areas where you would expect to see, and there tend to be large amounts of documentation which are produced, which, unless you really want to wade through, you just need to know are there. But if it's on an issue that matters to you, then you probably need to go and look at that evidence base to really understand the approach that's being taken. Local plans are not drawn up behind closed doors. There's a formal legal minimum requirements for engaging the public, but also other local authorities and statutory bodies in their preparation, but also informal feedback. So the council's already been through 2 sort of rounds of consultation. And it's just going through what's a formal round of consultation at the moment before it gets to an examination, and this is by a small number of planning inspectors. So these are independent outside inspectors who are, and I'll come on to this, looking at the plan in terms of whether it is sound or not, and soundness is the sort of language that's used, and the particular set of tests that are applied, which I'll explain in a moment. So there's a process here. This is just obviously lots of flowcharts you can imagine, which councils have to sort of go through, which is set out in law. They have to basically say what their approach is to involving people. They have to gather the information. They have to consult on the information and the sort of options they're exploring. They need to pull that together into a draft plan, consult on that, then put a final draft plan out for examination by the planning inspectorate. There's an inquiry that's held, or hearing that's held into that over a number of days. They then need to consider the recommendations from the planning inspectorate. They don't actually have to follow them. It's still discretionary. They're not dictated to. And then they have to agree the final plan. And that takes years. Which is why the current local plan review has been going for it'll be 3 years now, even in the kind of consultation stages. So there's a whole debate about how long it takes and why lots of plans are out of date, because local authorities haven't been able to, for whatever reason, review them or update them. And Merton's a bit slow in what it's doing, but it's not unusual in that. So you then get to the stage of actually writing the plan and the document. And this is where planning policies start to emerge. And this tends to be what people are commenting on when they're looking at what the local plan is and what it offers. But the policies are set in the context of what the ambition is for, in this case, the borough, and the objectives that are being set. So the vision is a statement of what they want the area to be like, what we want the area to be like in the future, in 2036, I think it is, in Merton's context. There's then a set of objectives, and then they inform what the policies are. So this is what Merton's got. I don't know whether you can read it on your screens. This is its vision, which is all lovely. Generally, people don't find much they disagree with here. It's sort of whether something's missing, but it's usually couched in very upbeat, positive, heartwarming, everyone wants it, everything's going to be lovely kind of language. You don't tend to get the conflicts which may exist between achieving all these different aspects of the vision. But those are the kinds of issues. Sometimes you can read something into the priorities, which are, by where they appear, if they're done in bullet point form as opposed to in narrative form. But that's what's in the and that's what you can comment on, and you can say, well, I don't agree with that, or I think it's missing this, or it should be worded more strongly in that way, or it should be much more ambitious, or whatever it might be. And then Merton's got a series of 5 objectives, and each of these has some words attached to it, just slightly unusual objectives, but they're not. They're just the way they're phrased, and only having 5 is a bit unusual. But they sort of cover the ground of what the issues are that the plan is going to deal with, although they don't. The plan is structured in a different way. It doesn't have chapter 1 being about resilience and chapter 2 about growth. And then we get on to the policies, and the policies are what often we're being asked to feedback on through the consultation, and that's what's the sort of the nub of the draft plan that's been produced. So what is a policy? I mean, we sort of all have policies. We have insurance policies and sort of other sorts of policies. But a planning policy is about 2 things really. One is it's anticipating what the requirements are going to be. So making provision for X number of houses in an area, but it's then also the thing against which a planning application gets judged. So a planning application comes in, has to fit within the policy, and if you didn't have planning policies, it would be a bit of a free-for-all, and the cumulative and combined effect of all the individual planning decisions wouldn't add up to anything coherent. So it's because you've got a planning policy which identifies metropolitan open land in London that we've got a lot of open land, and London is known for having lots of open land, because the importance that's attached to that land is shared across London in that case, not just in an individual borough, and everyone has to sort of stick by that. So if that was a bit of a free-fall, if we're making those decisions on the basis of each patch of metropolitan open land, on a case-by-case basis, then it'd be a much more fragmented result that would flow from that. And this is all valuable, and it's worth doing, because in law, planning decisions are plan-led. Now, I can't hear you because you're on mute, and there could be a certain amount of hollow laughter with the way in which some planning decisions which have been made in Merton, because they're not necessarily that well informed, particularly at the planning committee stage, by what the planning policies are. And there's certainly lots of examples which we could all cite of where planning decisions have been made which don't fit in very easily with the development plan. Now, it's really important, it's plan-led, it's not determined by the plan, it's not an absolute, it's not a complete constraint. So there is this phrase in planning law about unless material considerations indicate otherwise, and that's basically anything else that's relevant. But the fundamental point here is that the plan is the starting point. It's the primary influence on a planning decision. So you make your decisions in accordance with the plan unless there's a really good reason that you don't do it. So that's why it is worth putting time and effort into getting the right planning policies in place. There's a separate exercise, which is how you then get them to stick when planning decisions are being made. But that shouldn't deter us from trying to get the right policies in the plan in the first place. There are, I mean, these are just headings that I've identified. They're not sort of, other people would cut the cake in a different way. But there are 3 different sorts of planning policy, which you'll see. Largely the Merton policies are the second 2, not that many generic policies. But it's worth approaching those policies in understanding what they're trying to achieve. So generic policies are very, very broad. So here's an extract from one of the policies just on light pollution, which basically says development must be designed to minimize the impact of glare and light spill on amenity, biodiversity, and highways. I'm not sure that's even spelled correctly, but anyway. So that's an example of a generic policy. There's relatively few of those in the plan. Of these, so this is, again, it's an extract. So there's lots of policies where a certain sort of development needs to meet a whole set of criteria. And that's the judgment that's made when a planning decision is considered by a planning officer or by a planning committee, in theory. So here's an extract from the policy in the plan, in the draft plan, about what the criteria are if you're faced with an application for altering or extending a building, that it's got to basically fit in with the existing building. It's got to respect the gap between buildings. So if every other building in the street has got a 2-meter gap between it, and this one's got a 10-meter gap or 1-meter gap, and it's 4 stories high and the others are 3 stories high, and it's facing slightly the wrong way, and it's got a different sort of set of windows, or it just looks, the eave height is different. Those are all reasons why you might think that planning permission should not be given. Ideally, the effect of having a planning policy is you don't get the wrong sort of planning application coming in, because the applicant knows what's in the planning policy and therefore puts in a plan, an application, which fits these criteria. So you should be able to say yes to things because people have basically done their homework and anticipated what's going to be said. Of course, that's easier said than done. And there's lots of examples of where these issues are not necessarily followed through to the letter. And then you have site-based policies, and these are pretty important. And if you're interested in particular parts of the borough, then you'll want to look at what the site-based policies are. So this is Mitcham, and these are the sites that have been identified for development, specifically allocated for development in the Mitcham area, and the different parts of the borough have got these maps. And you'll notice each of those has got a code attached to it. So the big one in the left is the Benedict Wharf scheme that's currently the mayor's making decisions on at the moment for 850 homes. But we've also got on there, you know, a hospital site. We've got a car wash. We've got the Burn Bullock and Mitcham Cricket Pavilion. We've got the old fire station. We've got a school. We've got an old office. We've got a couple of car parks in the centre of Mitcham. We've got an old gasworks site. We've got basically the middle of Mitcham village with much of the development in the north end of the village. We've got the library. You know, there's a whole raft of different sites on that, almost all of which have got some form of development on at the moment. So it's about how the development will change. So that drills down. So you've got the I think it's, what am I going to, MI9. So that's right in the middle. That's the old fire station right in the middle of that map. So there's then this extract which shows you the precise boundary that they're talking about. That's the blue line. Often it's red, but it's blue in this case. That's the old fire station boundary, the allocation. And then there's and the detail doesn't matter, but there's a statement basically about what's expected to happen on this site, which is in the local plan, which gives you some basic information. It tells you some information about the building or the area or the constraints. So this is a locally listed building, for example. It's near a nationally listed building. It's in a conservation area. It's right next to a listed war memorial and some other locally listed buildings. It's right by a registered town green. And so it's saying there's a policy that's more about redevelopment than knocking it down and starting again, but probably will allow a bit of extension, but that extension has to fit with how it relates to the vestry hall, which is a civic building right next to it. So it gives a very strong steer as to what should be happening to the development on these sites. And so getting the policy right for a development site, this is what you need to be looking at and seeing if you agree with what's written down in the site allocations. But site-based policies are not just about development, they're also about other things. And here's an example of green space. So this is about protecting. Basically, it's more no change than we want to see change. So that's an example in the east of or southeast of the borough, Mitcham area again, of the Metropolitan Open Land and the open space, which is formally recognised and to be designated in the plan. So the big green space there is Mitcham Common in the bottom right. The sort of line of green space to the west of that is the Wandle Valley and Ravensby Park and Morden Hall Park. And then there's lots of other open space, you know, in and around, which some of it's very, very, very small, but very, very important. Some of it's obviously much, much bigger. So that's an area which you'd want to investigate. So I remember last time we looked at the local plan, in the Mitcham area, we know that it didn't quite get the boundaries to some of the open space, and so we fed in some views on that and got that collected. We then get, and I'm coming to a close pretty soon, to the so that is the plan, but that's where it fits in the planning system. But that is the kind of approach that are presented in the policies. So what can you do about it? How can you influence it? So this is the test that a local plan has to go through. So this is if you're a planning officer at Merton Council responsible for the local plan, you want to pass these tests. This is the thing that really matters to you, because if you pass these tests and your plan is declared sound, then your plan gets adopted by the local authority and you've done your job and you move on. And so this is what the planning inspectors are looking at. They're looking at whether the plan is sound, and these are the criteria. Has it been positively prepared? I mean, put crudely, they talk about sustainable development is the sort of language that's used. Basically, is it making allowance for the amount of new housing that's going to be required in the area, for the amount of school places that are going to be required in the area, but also, importantly, is it making enough allowance for the needs of nature, or for adapting to future changes in temperature? And when we're looking at 10, 20, 30 years ahead, clearly we need to be anticipating some of the environmental changes as well as the demographic changes that are going on. Critically, and this is often where you'll find lots of objections, this is the hook you hang them on, is it justified? Or is there a better way of doing it? Have you got different facts which basically say, no, that's wrong, because that building is really important, or that green space is important, and you've not said it's important, or you've allocated that site for development which could be 10 stories high, but actually, that's far too high, it should be only 5 stories high, or whatever it might be. So this is where you're basically querying the evidence base of the council, and whether they've engaged people enough in understanding what the needs are of the area. Then there's a will it ever happen test, and actually lots of plans never happen, and that's one of the problems, that they're slightly theoretical, and the development industry comes along and says, well, you might think we're going to develop like that, but actually we want to develop like this, or they put too many constraints on a site, so actually it never gets developed because it's not viable. But equally, this could be about, is there a strong enough relationship with the water company to make sure that the phasing of new water supply or new sewerage actually meets the timing of a new development. So it's getting the phasing right. You can't deliver something which is going to require a new water supply if the local water company hasn't got it in its program to put the new water in. And then last but not least, which can be important, particularly if a local authority goes a bit AWOL, is does it fit in with the higher order plans? So we're unusual in London, and we've got another plan which is as important as the local plan, which is the London plan, and which is the new London plan is at the very, very last gasp of it being adopted at the moment. The mayor actually just issued what he considers to be the final version of it yesterday, and the Secretary of State's got till the beginning of February to agree or otherwise, with that. Very, very detailed, very, very long document, but full of policies. And quite detailed policies, much more detailed than they have been historically, including ones that directly affect things going on in Merton, like housing numbers or allocation of metropolitan open land or things like that. And then there's national policy, which is set out in something called the National Planning Policy Framework, which is not quite as dull as it sounds. It's actually a better read than you might think, and is certainly worth a skim if you're wanting to sort of get a sense of the approach that's expected of local authorities, and the approach that's expected of everyone on planning decisions. So final things, when you're thinking about what you might want to do on the local plan, it's worth just thinking, so what are you trying to achieve? Is your interest that you basically interested in everything? Or are you particularly interested in Rains Park, or your street, or the open space, or one particular site? Which either you want to see developed, or you're concerned about what might happen? Or do you have an interest in trees, or in water, or in shops, or in housing? Do you have more of a thematic interest? And you can cut and slice and dice the plan depending on what your interest is, but you'll need to extract the stuff that's relevant to you, which may not be divided up or structured in the way that you know will work most usefully. We'll want to have a look at the evidence, particularly if you're looking at sort of detail. You know, if you're looking at trying to sort of question whether they've got some things right, you'll want to understand the evidence that they've produced, and that information's where it is in the public domain. It needs to be in the public domain eventually. Not all of it has been published yet. Will be available online. There may be things that really matter to you, which don't appear in the plan. So historically, things like light pollution, I think I gave the example, is something that lots of plans just don't talk about, but actually matter to a lot of people. You'll want to, if you are interested in the geography of locations, look at the site-based policies, whether they be for development or for nature or for heritage. And you'll want to look at the detailed wording of the policy and stress test it. You know, how weasel worded is it? Is it strong enough? There's always going to be wiggle room, but could it be more, could there be greater clarity or more certainty provided if the wording was tighter? And there's a whole sort of separate debate often about the precise drafting of policies and how to express what you're trying to achieve in a language which is assertive but also not overly directional, because a plan can very rarely dictate what has to happen because of those other material considerations. There's always other things that can be thought about. And whenever you are feeding in views, it's always good to be able to support your views with evidence. So that could be your own evidence, it could be your own experience of what's going on in an area, it could be your experience of planning applications that have taken place, which have sort of, as it were, gone wrong, and you want to stop them going wrong in the future. It could be you've done, I don't know, your own survey of the loss of green space or trees, or poor designs of development. You know, it depends on what matters to you. And the final two slides, some just real basics. That's where you can get the plan, and we'll circulate these slides. If I can do it in the chat, I will, but they'll be circulated afterwards. So you'll get these links there. You don't need to be clicking away. Don't think you've got to ape all the language that the document uses. You know, if you feel comfortable with it, that's fine, but plain English, and you know, the council positively encourages people to just say what they think. If you are commenting specifically on a policy or a particular site, then do reference it so they know what you're talking about. Otherwise, you know, they're left, imagine being the person who's going through all this and not knowing what your comments relate to. It is very important that you state that you object to the plan. So even if you want to make lots of positive noises about the bits you like, and this is an unfortunate thing with planning, it sort of forces you to be adversarial, because unless you say you object it, you don't get a right to be heard at the examination. So you may not want to take up that right. You may not want to appear at the hearing, which will take place. But if you want to leave that option open, then you want to say that you object. Don't miss the deadline. In some ways, it's probably a more significant deadline than they are on planning applications. Equally, they often move the deadline. Just in the background today, I've spotted a couple of really basic errors. They've just put the wrong information in on certain pages, so they may have to revisit some of that and decide whether they have to consult on some things. And so when you go into the link, you're encouraged to use the questionnaire. And if you want to use the questionnaire, that's fine, but don't feel that you have to be forced into using sort of straitjacketed by the questionnaire. You can send in freestanding responses. The councils confirm that they will accept those, and the emails, you know, online as well, to get those into them. So say it how you want to say it, rather than feeling you've got to fit the boxes that you're being given. And finally, if you really want to delve in more, then there's going to be a few links there which you can use later, various guides that have been produced on how to write planning policies or how to get involved in local plans. I was intrigued to find the Friends of the Earth document came out in December 2020 on local plan examinations. So they've obviously just produced that, or CPRE's more general one, which is a slightly softer read, more accessible than the Friends of the Earth documents. And that's it. So I'm going to stop sharing, and it's up to whatever anyone wants to do next, really, as to where we take the conversation.
to